So as we jump into MBTI, we really want to understand what our personality type is or what psychological type is. So it really started with a theory of personality, which was developed by Carl Jung, and he explained that there were actually normal differences between healthy people. And he went through and identified that these differences in behavior resulted from inborn tendencies, which we would call nature, right? And the way that people were raised, which may have been more of the nurture side, and that we act on these tendencies. Now, these kinds of tendencies actually develop into our behavior, and then Carl Jung went through and he defined that there were 8 different patterns to these normal behavior types. Within these different types, he decided and observed that when people's minds were active, that they were really involved within 2 mental activities. So they either were taking in information, which we call perceiving, or they were organizing that information and coming to a conclusion, which we call judging. Now, then he identified that there were actually 2 opposite ways that people perceive, and he called those sensations. Now, Myers and Briggs later renamed this as sensing, that there was also intuition. Now, the opposite 2 ways that people judge were called thinking and feeling. So we now also look and see that there is a way that people focus their energy. And Jung noticed that people tend to be more energized by the external world of people and experience and activities and emotions, or they may really be more into the internal world of ideas and memories. And he called these 2 orientations extroversion. Do note, though, that there is an A in extroversion, and also introversion. So extroverted people tend to look to the outside world in order to get energy. Introverted people are going to reflect and be more on the inside. So while each of these 4 mental processes, sensing, intuition, thinking, and feeling, they're all very predictable characteristics, and they're going to be different for each person, and especially are going to be different comparing an extrovert to an introvert. As we move forward, we can see that there were 8 mental functions. So let's look at those quickly. As we combined these orientations of the world, that would be our perceiving with our judging, then we found that there were fundamental patterns of the mental activity that went on within people. So perceiving people, or remember that perceiving was actually the way that people were taking in their information. It was either taken in through an extroverted methodology of sensing or intuition, or an introverted methodology of sensing and introversion. And again, when we look at judging, is how people were organizing and coming to conclusions. And those were divided into 4 separate ways as well: extroverted, intuition, and sensing, and that introverted, intuition, and sensing. So these 8 mental processes are available to everyone, and they're actually used by everyone, although everyone really has an innate preference or desire, the one that's really natural to them. So the natural one is the one that is going to lead the functions over the others. It's going to direct the energy to them, and it's always going to help them to develop habits of behavior and personality patterns. Now, the really interesting thing is that those preferred mental processes, Jung called those a dominant function. So there's differences in the mental function that is preferred and used and developed, which leads to these differences between people. It's what makes them unique. And it also results in these predictable patterns of behaviors. That is what it all comes down to and forms our personality type or psychological types. So there are 16 different types, and Jung focused on accurately describing the 8 dominant functions that he identified. But he saw that people also use the other functions in a hierarchy of preferences, and we all do that. The terms that he used were a dominant function, an auxiliary function, a tertiary function, and an inferior function. The inferior function sometimes is called the fourth function as well. It's probably the most least preferred. So we're going to discuss this a little bit more in our course as we get further forward. But Briggs and Myers developed this idea even further, and they included the role of how we had an introverted and extroverted functions. So you're going to be able to see that right here on our screen that this particular table shows us each of the functions and the preferences for each one. So let's look at the ESTP. Their very dominant function is an extroverted sensing. That means that what people see is that they're sensing function, and that's what gets used the most, and it's also their dominant one. However, their secondary function is an introverted thinking. So although it's there, people don't tend to see it. Then they have a tertiary and the inferior one, which is the least preferred. So every single MBTI type is going to have these hierarchy, and they're going to have preferred ways of dealing with their mental processes. So there's 4 preference scales, and this is what leads to our 16 different types. Now remember that this is not really dynamic, meaning that everything is going to be all the way at one end or another. This is actually a spectrum. So you may be a little bit extroverted and a lot introverted, right? So I want you to think of it more as a scale. So you are on a 0 might be the line in the middle and 100 on each end, right? So maybe you are 50% introverted and 50% extroverted. What does that mean? You're right in the middle. So every single one of these different preferences are a scale. It goes from one end to another. And that's what makes individuals very unique, because we can't just say that you're 100% extroverted. Or maybe you've got somebody who's introverted who uses extroverted tendencies in order to function in the world. So here are our different scales: extroverted, introverted, sensing, intuition, thinking, feeling, judging, and perceiving. And we're going to look a little bit more into this as we go through each one. But remember that each preference that's identified by the MBTI is actually an aspect of personality, and it's going to help us to understand ourselves and others, and it's going to help us to really define each of our preferences.